The Dark Scrolls. The morning of May the 19th, 1536, dawned cold and pale over the Tower of London. The fortress stood in its grey Norman stone, walls scarred by centuries of fear. Within, on the damp grass of Tower Green, carpenters had raised a simple wooden scaffold, bare planks, set high enough for all to see, unadorned, without mercy. The crowd pressed close, Londoners in wool cloaks and coarse hoods, noblemen in fur-trimmed mantles, guards in steel helmets glinting under a reluctant sun. Their breath curled white in the air, as though the earth itself exhaled in dread. From the tower's archway she emerged, Anne Boleyn, once Queen of England. She wore a gown of dark damask, the fabric heavy against her slight frame, with a mantle of ermine draped about her shoulders. Her French hood framed a face drained of blood, yet unbroken in composure. Around her slender neck, where once had rested the famous bee pendant, there was now only emptiness, as though the jewels themselves had abandoned her. Behind the throng stood men of power, courtiers in velvets embroidered with gold, their eyes fixed yet unreadable. Some remembered her laughter in the great halls of Whitehall, now silenced forever. Others whispered prayers, or perhaps curses, under their breath. Among them lingered one who drew no notice, a servant in plain wool, cloak drawn tight, bonnet low. He was Thomas Cromwell's watcher, the unseen observer, the spy whose gaze absorbed every detail, and whose silence would outlast them all. The air was thick with stillness. The French swordsman stepped forward, blade hidden beneath straw to keep it sharp, his boots echoing on the boards. The Queen knelt, her hands folded, lips moving in prayer. The crowd leaned in, frozen between pity and dread. And there, in that suspended moment before steel and flesh met, history itself held its breath. But this story does not begin and end on the scaffold. To understand why one man's silence mattered for 40 years, we must turn back to the world of Thomas Cromwell, the architect of Anne's destruction and the master of spies who thrived in the shadows. The parchment is brittle now, its edges browned by centuries of handling. But beneath the faded ink, a story emerges that once lay hidden in silence for nearly half a lifetime. It begins in the restless heart of Tudor England, where ambition and fear intermingled like smoke in the chambers of Whitehall, and where every whispered word carried the weight of survival. Among the countless names that passed through the corridors of Henry VIII's reign, one remains cloaked in deliberate obscurity. A man who listened, who observed, and who never spoke until age had already stolen much of his strength. He was a shadow in service of Thomas Cromwell, the king's formidable minister, and he bore witness to one of the most dreadful spectacles of the 16th century: the death of a queen. For 40 years he carried the vision of that morning within him, guarded behind lips sealed tighter than any lock. Until at last, in the dim light of old age, he permitted fragments of truth to slip into the writ. 10 record. The England into which this figure steps was one trembling on the threshold of change. The Catholic faith that had bound the kingdom for centuries was fracturing under the weight of Henry's quarrel with Rome. Land and power, once distributed through the vast wealth of monasteries, were being seized, dissolved, and parceled to new men of influence who owed their station to Cromwell's designs. The court itself was a hive of rivalries, where men of noble blood distrusted the rise of common-born secretaries, and where women of charm and wit could ascend to the throne only to be cast down as swiftly as they had risen. It was in this crucible of ambition that Cromwell's intelligence network flourished, a net cast wide across the realm, gathering morsels of treachery, heresy, and indiscretion. The spy who concerns us was but one thread in that vast web. His name, carefully veiled in subsequent accounts, was never permitted to rise to prominence, for survival often demanded erasure as much as it did loyalty. He was neither a nobleman nor a courtier of dazzling influence. His strength lay in silence, in watching without betraying himself. Cromwell required such men, for it was not always the mighty who supplied the most useful knowledge. It was often the overlooked, the quiet servant in a corner, the clerk with ink-stained fingers, the man who could melt into the crowd and reappear later with words that shifted the balance of power. To live as such a creature was both a safeguard and a curse, for while anonymity preserved life, it condemned memory to shadow. Anne Boleyn, the brilliant and dangerous queen, had by this time become the fulcrum upon which England's destiny balanced. Her marriage to Henry had torn the kingdom from the papal embrace, and her body was expected to secure the future through the birth of sons. Yet the promise of glory curdled into disfavor when her womb failed to produce the heir that might silence dissent. Whispers of infidelity, whether born of truth or invention, swirled about her, fanned by those who desired her fall. Cromwell, sensing both opportunity and peril, began to assemble his case. Witnesses were summoned, accusations refined, and at the heart of it all stood a minister whose genius for manipulation ensured that every testimony aligned with the king's growing impatience. Our spy stood not at the forefront of these machinations, but within reach of the beating pulse of events. He watched as lords and courtiers shifted allegiance with the winds, as Anne's former allies shrank back into caution, and as the machinery of justice, if it may be called such, prepared to grind her down. Whether he believed the charges mattered little. His role was not to judge but to see, to record in the privacy of memory, and to deliver to Cromwell whatever detail might serve the cause. Yet the greater weight was not what he reported, but what he chose to withhold. For though his eyes absorbed the entirety of the trial and the execution, his mouth remained closed long after the last echo of the axe faded from Tower Green. The morning of May 19th, 1536, is etched into countless chronicles, though each account strains to capture the same terrible clarity. The spy stood among the throng within the tower, pressed shoulder to shoulder with Londoners summoned by curiosity, nobles compelled by duty, and guards ensuring the king's command was fulfilled. Anne appeared, clad in a gown of deep damask and a mantle of ermine, her face pale but resolute. The French swordsman, summoned from Calais for his skill in swiftness, stood ready. Few in the crowd understood the meaning of her calm prayers. Fewer still perceived the faint trembling of her hands. But one pair of eyes, belonging to Cromwell's servant, absorbed every motion. The lift of her chin, the sheen of tears unfallen, the moment her body yielded to steel. He saw, and he did not forget. What passed in his heart as he turned away from the scaffold remains unknown. Speculate fear held his tongue, for Henry's court was no place for loose words. Others imagine loyalty bound him, for Cromwell demanded obedience that often bordered on devotion. Still others suggest he bore within him a secret contempt for the brutality he had witnessed, a contempt he dared not voice until age itself had rendered him immune from reprisal. Whatever the cause, silence became his constant companion. Through the reign of Henry, through the brief interlude of Edward, through the fires of Mary, and into the long twilight of Elizabeth, he endured. Decades slipped by, and the memory of Anne's death receded into history's mist. But within him the scene remained sharp, undimmed, a wound unhealed. It was only in his declining years, when the frailty of age loosened the bonds of discretion, that fragments of his account began to surface. Whether he spoke them to a confidant or inscribed them in some hidden memorandum cannot be determined with certainty. What survives is the sense of a man haunted, compelled at last to place upon record what he had carried alone. Yet, even in disclosure, he retained shadows, leaving gaps that stir modern minds to speculation. Was he withholding further truths that might have imperiled reputations still honored in Elizabeth's day? Or had time itself distorted memory, weaving strands of remorse into the fabric of recollection? This uncertainty is the essence of the tale, for what we hold here is not a polished chronicle of indisputable fact, but a fragment of lived experience refracted through silence, fear, and age. It stands as both a testimony and a riddle. To study it is to glimpse not only the fall of a queen, but the secret life of a man whose very survival depended upon invisibility. He belonged to Cromwell's invisible army, men whose names seldom surface in gilded volumes, yet whose watchful eyes and sealed lips altered the course of kingdoms. And so, as this faded parchment is unrolled, the story unfolds with the solemn solemnity of a candle guttering in a dark archive. We are invited not merely to recall a queen's death, but to inhabit the gaze of one who saw and chose to endure in silence. The corridors of Tudor power were built as much upon silence as upon proclamation. In that silence lived the spy, carrying for 40 years the vision of Anne Boleyn's final breath. His legacy is not found in monuments nor heraldry, but in the haunting recognition that history is written not only by kings and ministers, but by those who watched and waited, their truths entombed within themselves until the weight of years forced revelation. Time, relentless and impartial, pressed forward in the years after the scaffold was washed clean of Anne Boleyn's blood. For the spy who had stood among the witnesses, life returned to its ordinary shadows, though the echo of that morning remained etched in his private consciousness. England itself, however, was anything but ordinary. The machinery that had condemned the Queen did not halt with her death. It continued to grind through the decades, reshaping the realm, consuming those who once seemed untouchable, and leaving scars that no parchment can fully erase. Thomas Cromwell, the architect of so many schemes, rose higher still in the immediate aftermath. His enemies, both noble and clerical, feared his reach. With the wealth of dissolved monasteries flowing into the crown, and with the king's favor firmly secured, Cromwell appeared invincible. Yet the spy who remained quietly at his side understood the fragility of such power. He had seen how swiftly Anne had fallen, and he knew that no man, however cunning, was beyond the caprice of Henry's will. Silence was the spy's shield, and in silence he continued to observe. Within the records of that time, faint traces appear of anonymous messengers, nameless clerks, and quiet men dispatched to watch the behavior of courtiers or gather rumors from the taverns of London. These were the sinews of Cromwell's system, and though their names are absent, their impact is undeniable. They fed their master with intelligence that allowed him to anticipate rebellion, to suppress dissent, and to destroy rivals before rivals could destroy him. Our spy was among them, an instrument sharpened by necessity, his identity deliberately blurred, for anonymity was his greatest armor. Yet even the most carefully wrought designs falter when ambition overreaches. By the early 1540s, Cromwell himself fell victim to the very machinery he had perfected. His orchestration of Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves, a union that proved politically advantageous but personally abhorrent to the king, sealed his fate. In 1540, the axe that had severed Anne Boleyn's life descended upon Cromwell as well. It is tempting to imagine the spy once again among the crowd, watching his master's downfall as he had watched the Queen's, silently carrying another scar of memory into the vault of his conscience. If so, he would have recognized the cruel symmetry. The hand that had arranged Anne's death, now struck off by the same monarch who had once praised Cromwell as indispensable. What became of the spy in the aftermath of Cromwell's execution is uncertain. Without the protection of his patron, one might expect him to vanish, consumed by the same ruthless tide that drowned so many. Yet he endured. Survival required adaptability, and he appears to have shifted from open service into the quieter recesses of the bureaucratic world, where clerks and minor officials labored in obscurity. There, hidden from the glare of politics, he continued to live, carrying within him the forbidden knowledge of what he had seen and heard in the fateful spring of 1536. The decades that followed were not kind to England. Henry's later years were marked by increasing cruelty, physical decay, and paranoia. The court became a place of ceaseless intrigue, where wives were discarded, favorites executed, and even princes trembled before their father's wrath. The spy aged through this storm, keeping to the shadows. He watched Jane Seymour die in childbed after bearing Henry a son, Edward. He watched the fleeting marriage to Anne of Cleves dissolve in humiliation, the fiery Catherine Howard condemned to the same scaffold where Anne Boleyn had perished, and finally, the quiet Catherine Parr, who managed, against all odds, to survive the king himself. When Henry died in 1547, leaving a boy king to inherit a kingdom fractured by religion and ambition, the spy was already an old man. Yet he continued, silent and unassuming, as the realm plunged into fresh convulsions. Under Edward VI, Protestant reforms accelerated, reshaping the liturgy and stripping away centuries of tradition. To speak against such changes was dangerous, but to embrace them too fervently could also invite suspicion. The spy, practiced in invisibility, adapted once more, his silence now serving him in an age where words could ignite pyres. Mary I's accession in 1553 ushered in another reversal, as the old faith was restored with fire and iron. Hundreds were burned as heretics, suspicion reigned as neighbors denounced one another, and the air of England grew heavy with the stench of martyrdom. The spy had witnessed Anne Boleyn's final prayer. Now, in his declining years, he may have stood within crowds that watched men and women perish in flames. Each death was another reminder that silence was survival. Whatever knowledge he carried of Anne's innocence or guilt, whatever opinion he harbored of Cromwell's machinations, he kept locked within himself. To speak would have been one to invite peril from whichever side held power at the moment. Then came Elizabeth, whose long reign stretched into the closing years of the century. By then the spy was aged, perhaps infirm, yet still haunted by the memory of Anne's last words. Elizabeth, The daughter of the queen he had seen fall, now ruled with authority and brilliance, turning the kingdom into a Protestant bastion. In Elizabeth's triumph lay a bitter irony. The mother executed for treason, the daughter exalted as Gloriana. If the spy at last gave voice to his memories in these years, it may have been out of a desire to reconcile the contradictions of a life spent observing the ruthless tides of fortune. What exactly he revealed, and how, remains shrouded. Some suggest he dictated his recollections to a younger confidant, who preserved them in secret notes. Others argue he left behind marginalia in legal or ecclesiastical records, hints that only later generations recognized for what they were. The details are indistinct, blurred by the passing of centuries, yet the essence is clear. After 4 decades of silence, he allowed a portion of his truth to seep into the written word. The account he offered was not a full confession, nor a polished chronicle. Rather, it was a fragment, a sliver of lived experience pressed between layers of memory and fear. He spoke of the morning air at the tower, of Anne's composed dignity, of the uncanny swiftness with which the sword fell. He hinted at the unease among those who had gathered, at the recognition that justice and expedience had become indistinguishable in Henry's court. Yet he refrained from condemning outright, perhaps unwilling to pass judgment even in old age. It was left to others to interpret, to debate whether his silence had been an act of cowardice, prudence, or loyalty. His decision to remain silent for so long has drawn speculation ever since. Was it fear of retribution? Cromwell himself had perished, yet the king's wrath lived on in memory, and the Tudor apparatus of control remained formidable under subsequent rulers. Was it loyalty to the system that had sustained him, a refusal to betray the secrets of the office he once served? Or was it, perhaps, guilt, an unspoken acknowledgement that by standing silent, he had become complicit in the destruction of a queen? The truth may lie in a mingling of all these motives, a tangle of survival, duty, and regret, that no single explanation can fully unravel. What is certain is that his silence shaped the way history remembers Anne Boleyn. Had he spoken earlier, had he denounced the charges as fabrications, or revealed hidden manipulations, the narrative of her fall might have shifted. Yet by withholding, he allowed the official version to harden into orthodoxy. Only later did his testimony, faint and partial, begin to trouble the waters, raising doubts that have never entirely stilled. Thus, his silence itself became a force in history, as powerful in its way as any proclamation. The story of the spy is not merely the story of one man's secrecy. It is the story of how history itself is formed in the tension between what is said and what is left unsaid. Every chronicle is shaped as much by silence as by speech. The spy's long withholding reminds us that beneath the polished narratives lie countless unspoken truths, locked within hearts too fearful or too weary to release them. His eventual disclosure, late and cautious, is both revelation and reminder. Revelation of what one man saw, reminder of how much more remains unseen. Thus the second act of his tale closes not with triumph, nor with clarity, but with the enduring ambiguity of human memory. The spy lived long enough to witness the fall of his master, the upheavals of faith, the fires of persecution, and the rise of the queen whose mother's death he had once observed. Through it all he remained a figure of shadows, defined by what he did not say. Only in the twilight of his life did the shadows part enough for us to glimpse the burden he had carried. And so the parchment is turned, revealing more than a personal confession. It reveals the anatomy of power itself, the way silence sustains tyranny, the way truth delayed is truth diminished, and the way memory, however faint, can still disturb centuries after the axe has fallen. The years of Elizabeth's reign stretched into a golden age for England. But for the spy, who had carried the memory of Anne Boleyn's death since youth, it was an age shaded by the contrast between past and present. He was by then an old man, bent with years, his hair turned silver, his hands marked by the tremors of time. Yet his mind remained sharp, and within it lived a vision more vivid than the daylight before his eyes. The scaffold, the queen in her final dignity, the flash of the Frenchman's blade. That moment, seared into him, was never loosened by passing decades. The world around him had changed almost beyond recognition. The England of Elizabeth was not the England of Henry. The turbulence of the boy King Edward and the fires of Mary had given way to a kingdom that sought stability in the person of the Virgin Queen. Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, reigned with a confidence that astonished foreign courts and unsettled her enemies. She crafted an image of unyielding majesty, draped in gowns stiff with jewels and pearls, crowned with the aura of Gloriana. Yet behind the splendor lay a truth that the spy alone could never escape. This woman was the child of the condemned queen, the child of the scaffold he had watched in silence. It is said that the old often turn inward, sifting through their lives for meaning. For the spy, this search became an act of reckoning. He had seen two Cromwells fall, Thomas, the master who built the machine, and Gregory, who lived under its shadow. He had seen Henry's wives rise and perish. He had lived through rebellions in the north, the terror of foreign invasion, the threat of papal excommunication. And through it all, he had remained invisible. His survival owed to discretion. Yet as age stripped away ambition and fear alike, he began to wonder whether silence had cost him his soul. The fragments that survive of his reflections suggest a man both tormented and resigned. He wrote, or perhaps spoke to one who transcribed, that truth, once chained, never wholly dies. It lingers, gnaws, and demands release. He admitted that he had carried knowledge others would have killed to obtain. He had heard Cromwell speak in hushed tones of assembling the case against Anne, of weaving together confessions and rumors into a tapestry convincing enough to satisfy Henry. He had seen lords reluctant to condemn her, pressed until their assent was extracted. He had watched courtiers feign grief while secretly rejoicing at her ruin. He bore within him the recognition that her death was not the verdict of impartial justice, but the outcome of a political necessity, choreographed by men who knew the king's will before it was spoken. Yet he stopped short of declaring Anne wholly innocent. In this, his testimony remains elusive. Perhaps he feared overstating what memory could not guarantee. Perhaps he harbored his own doubts, stirred by years of whispers that she had indeed entangled herself in dangerous flirtations. What is clear is that he perceived the machinery of her destruction as deliberate, even if the charges themselves were clouded. This ambiguity is the essence of his legacy. He leaves us not certainty, but a mirror of the uncertainty that haunted him. By the 1570s, the spy was a relic of another age. Few who had stood at Tower Green in 1536 still lived. Elizabeth's courtiers, many of them too young to remember her mother's fall, preferred not to dwell on that dark origin. The Queen herself never publicly spoke of Anne's execution, as though silence could erase the trauma. Yet in private, she preserved relics of her mother, jewels, a small portrait, the famous initial B that Anne once wore. For the spy, to see the daughter enthroned while the mother remained condemned must have stirred an unbearable irony. He was one of the last living bridges between the two, the silent custodian of a memory that Elizabeth herself could never safely address. It was in these years, scholars suggest, that he finally allowed himself to speak more openly. He may have found a sympathetic listener among the younger clerks or ministers who valued his long service. Perhaps he confided to a priest, in the manner of a confession. Or perhaps he wrote in his own hand, intending his words to be hidden until death rendered them harmless. However it occurred, pieces of his testimony entered the current of memory, preserved in marginal notes and second-hand citations that later chroniclers would puzzle over. The tone of these late recollections is weary, tinged with bitterness. He described himself as a man who had walked through storms unseen, who had swallowed words that might have freed him had he dared. He admitted to envying those who perished swiftly, Anne, Cromwell, Catherine Howard, because they at least left clarity in their endings, while he remained, burdened by the silence that had sustained him. He spoke of waking from dreams in which the scaffold reappeared, the Queen's lips moving in prayer, the crowd murmuring as the executioner raised his blade. The dreams never left him, even as his body weakened. The Elizabethan court, for all its pageantry, was not free from the same dangers he had known in his youth. Intrigue still flourished, spies still whispered in dark corners. Plots against the Queen multiplied as foreign powers sought to undo her. The irony cannot be ignored. The spy who once served Cromwell's network now lived in a realm where Elizabeth herself commanded an even larger apparatus of intelligence, guided by men like Francis Walsingham. He must have seen in their methods a reflection of what he had once been part of, proof that the world had not changed, only shifted its actors. And so his testimony, late and incomplete, becomes not just the story of one queen's fall, but the story of how silence and secrecy shape nations. His 40 years of withholding demonstrate how easily history bends when the witnesses remain mute. Only in his final years, when fear no longer held dominion, did he permit his truth to surface. Even then it was partial, elusive, more a whisper than a proclamation. Yet that whisper reverberated across centuries, disturbing the official version, compelling later generations to ask, what was hidden, what was contrived, and what price was paid for survival? In this, the spy stands as a symbol of an entire age. The Tudor world was one where truth was dangerous, where loyalty could be fatal, and where survival often required complicity. He embodied these contradictions, living long where others perished, but carrying a burden that denied him peace. His silence preserved his body, but it corroded his spirit. When he finally spoke, his words bore the weight of that corrosion, heavy with regret, yet incapable of full disclosure. To imagine him in his final days is to picture a man seated in a dim chamber, parchment before him, quill trembling in an unsteady hand. Around him the sounds of Elizabethan London filtered through narrow windows. W.S., the calls of vendors, the tolling of bells, the distant rumble of carts on cobblestones. Yet within that chamber lay a world far removed. A morning in May, 40 years gone. still alive in his memory as though no time had passed. He wrote not to absolve himself nor to accuse others, but simply to unburden a soul that had borne too much. He knew that once he was gone, others would shape his words to their own purposes. That is the nature of history. But he hoped, perhaps, that by leaving some trace, he might prevent complete erasure. His legacy is paradoxical. He remains unnamed, faceless, a cipher in the chronicles. Yet through his silence and his eventual whisper, he altered the way we perceive Anne Boleyn's fall. He reminds us that behind every public spectacle there are private witnesses, unseen, unheard, yet essential. His story is not one of grandeur or triumph, but of endurance, regret, and the strange power of secrecy. Thus, the third chapter of his tale closes in twilight. The spy, aged and weary, left behind fragments of memory that continue to unsettle. He did not exonerate Anne, nor condemn her, but he revealed the hollowness of the process that destroyed her. He showed that beneath the pageantry of Tudor justice lay fear, ambition, and manipulation, and he demonstrated that silence, while it preserves, also distorts, for by remaining mute, he allowed the lie to grow stronger. By speaking too late, he ensured his truth could never wholly correct it. The parchment fades here, the ink thinning as though even the hand that wrote it hesitated, but the meaning endures. History is not only what kings decree or what chroniclers record. It is also what one man carries in silence for a lifetime, and what he finally dares to release when the shadows lengthen and the end approaches. The parchment grows heavier as the story enters its most troubled passages, where silence no longer appears as a neutral choice, but as an accomplice to cruelty. By the time the spy had reached his final decades, the weight of what he had withheld pressed upon him with increasing severity. It was not merely that he had borne witness to Anne Boleyn's end, but that his silence had contributed to the preservation of a falsehood that shaped the destiny of the realm. In his private recollections, fragmentary though they are, we sense a man haunted less by what he saw than by what he failed to say. The tragedy of his life lies in this tension. He survived where others perished, yet his survival demanded complicity. The scaffold at Tower Green had claimed queens and ministers, but it had also claimed their reputations. Anne's name remained stained by the charges of adultery and treason, charges that historians even then doubted, yet dared not publicly repudiate. The spy, who could have testified to the manipulations behind her fall, chose instead to remain mute. That silence ensured his safety, but left the lie intact. His reflections, as pieced together from scattered notes, reveal the depth of his torment. He described himself as buried among the living, a phrase that captures the peculiar half-life of those who survive by erasing their own voice. He spoke of watching men condemn Anne while knowing their assent was extracted under duress, and of hearing Cromwell instruct his agents on how to shape testimony so that it appeared irrefutable. He admitted that he could have contradicted some of those accounts, could have exposed contradictions, but he did not. Fear sealed his mouth. Fear, and the knowledge that to speak would be to court death. Yet survival did not free him from judgment. The years stretched on, and with them came the realization that he had sacrificed honor for longevity. He lived long enough to see Cromwell fall, long enough to see Elizabeth exalted, long enough to outlast nearly all of his contemporaries. But longevity without peace is a barren gift. He confessed to envying those who met swift ends, for their truth at least went with them into death uncorrupted. His truth remained within him, gnawing like a worm in wood. The betrayals of the Tudor court formed a mirror for his own. He had witnessed friends denounce friends, families torn apart by loyalty to one faction or another, and noble houses extinguished in the flames of suspicion. Each betrayal echoed his own silent betrayal of Anne, for though he had not raised a false accusation, his refusal to speak was its own form of treachery. He recognized this, writing that, "A tongue held still may wound more cruelly than a sword." These words, preserved in later transcripts, encapsulate the paradox of his existence. His silence both preserved and destroyed. The tragedies he recorded extend beyond Anne herself. He described Catherine Howard's execution in 1542, another young queen brought low by charges of infidelity. Though he was not present at her death, he heard accounts from those who were, and he felt the haunting repetition of Anne's fate. For him, Catherine's fall was proof that the pattern of betrayal and manipulation continued, that Anne had not been an exception, but the beginning of a cycle. He wrote that, "The scaffold remembers, though the stone forgets," suggesting that each execution carved an invisible scar into the soul of the realm. He also reflected on the fates of men accused alongside Anne: George Boleyn, Mark Smeaton, Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton. He had seen some of them before their imprisonment, men of wit and talent, whose lives ended in ruin. He admitted that the charges against them were as suspect as those against Anne, and he suggested that their deaths served not justice, but convenience. To him, they were casualties of a system where guilt was predetermined and trials mere performance. His inability to defend them weighed upon him as heavily as his silence regarding the Queen. The deeper tragedy, however, was personal. Though his name remains hidden, the fragments of his testimony suggest that he once knew Anne, not only as queen, but as a presence at court before her downfall. He described her smile as quick, her temper as sharp, her eyes as filled with an energy that unsettled those around her. These were not the words of a man entirely detached. They carry the intimacy of one who had observed her closely, perhaps even admired her. That admiration, crushed by his silence at her death, transformed into lifelong remorse. He confessed that when Elizabeth was crowned, he wept, not for joy, but for the mother whose name could not be spoken without shadow. His account of Elizabeth's reign is tinged with bitterness at the persistence of secrecy. Though he admired her intelligence and strength, he noted that she too maintained silence about her mother. In this, he saw a reflection of his own failing. Truth be buried for the sake of survival. The daughter's refusal to rehabilitate Anne mirrored the spy's own refusal to defend her. Both were bound by the same necessity, the same fear of destabilizing the fragile balance of power. He recognized in Elizabeth the same silence that had governed his life, and he wondered whether it, too, would one day be judged as complicity. The conflicts that surrounded him were not merely political but spiritual. He lived through the violent oscillations of England's faith, from Catholic to Protestant to Catholic and back again. Each shift brought executions, martyrs, and betrayals. He confessed to doubting both sides, not because he disbelieved in faith, but because he saw how religion was wielded as a weapon of power. In this, he perceived the same pattern that had destroyed Anne, the manipulation of belief to justify expedience. His silence, he realized, had allowed not only the death of a queen, but the corruption of truth itself. In one particularly striking passage, he likened himself to Cain, wandering with an invisible mark upon him. His mark was not blood spilled by his own hand, but the memory of blood spilled before his eyes, blood he had failed to protest. He wrote of hearing the cries of conscience at night, of seeing Anne's face in the shadows, of imagining her reproach. These confessions reveal a man consumed by inner conflict, a man whose long life became a punishment rather than a gift. Yet even in this torment he sought meaning. He wrote that perhaps his silence was not entirely in vain, for it allowed him to live long enough to see Anne's daughter vindicated. In Elizabeth's triumph, he found a measure of redemption. He saw that though Anne had perished, her bloodline had not been extinguished. The daughter carried forward the mother's legacy, even if unspoken. To him, this was proof that truth, though buried, could not be wholly destroyed. The irony was cruel, but it offered him a glimmer of solace. Still, he could not escape, because the sense that his own life had been wasted in shadows. He described himself as a ghost in daylight, unseen yet burdened, present yet absent. His survival had made him a witness to an entire century of upheaval, but his refusal to speak when it mattered most left him feeling that he had contributed nothing but silence. In the end, his tragedy was not only Anne's death, but his own erasure. He survived, but he left no name, no monument, no legacy beyond the fragments of his confession. This is the essence of his story. A man caught between fear and truth, between loyalty and conscience, between survival and honor. His silence preserved him but condemned him. His survival allowed him to witness history, but his silence ensured that history forgot him. Only in the faint whispers that reached us does his presence endure, a reminder of the countless others who lived and died in silence, their truths lost. The fourth passage of his tale thus closes not with resolution, but with the full world, 8 of conflict and betrayal. It reveals a man torn by remorse, haunted by tragedy, and consumed by the recognition that his silence had betrayed not only a queen, but himself. It is a story of survival at the cost of honor, of longevity at the cost of peace, of truth buried until it became indistinguishable from shadow. And as the parchment is turned once more, we sense that the end approaches, that the spy's life nears its close. Yet before it does, his legacy must be reckoned with. What his silence meant, what his final words conveyed, and how history continues to grapple with the truths he withheld. The last leaf of the manuscript is the most fragile. Its ink is faint, its edges frayed, as if time itself conspired to erase the final words of a man who had spent a lifetime erasing himself. Yet within those pale lines rests the culmination of his story, the reckoning of a witness who lived too long, who bore too much, and who released too little. In his final years, the spy was a figure of obscurity. He held no great office, commanded no estates, and moved in no circles of influence. He had become what he had always striven to be, invisible. Yet invisibility, once his shield, had become his prison. Old age confined him to narrow chambers where he lingered, half forgotten, surrounded by papers few would ever read. To the bustling city outside, he was another anonymous relic of a bygone reign. Only in the solitude of his thoughts did he remain bound to the morning of May 19th, 1536. He wrote, or perhaps dictated in a trembling voice, that as death approached, memories grew sharper, not dimmer. The scaffold, the Queen's composure, the silence before the stroke, all returned with an intensity that eclipsed the present. "The years have not buried it," he confessed, "but sharpened it." He acknowledged that he had lived in silence because he feared the consequences of speech. But he also admitted that silence had consumed him more surely than any sword could have. He compared himself to a man condemned to carry an unhealed wound, invisible to others, yet bleeding within. In these final reflections, he offered something close to judgment, not of Anne, nor of Cromwell, nor even of Henry, but of himself. He declared that survival without truth is a form of death, that to live long while suppressing justice is to wander as a shade among men. He confessed to envying those who died young with honor intact, for their memory endured even when their lives did not. His own memory, he feared, would vanish with him, leaving no mark but whispers. Yet he also recognized a paradox. By surviving, he had become a custodian of memory, however reluctant. His silence had preserved not only himself, but the possibility that truth might one day emerge. He wrote, almost defiantly, that silence does not destroy truth, it only delays it. And indeed, his late disclosures, fragmentary, elusive, incomplete, would ripple across the centuries, troubling historians, unsettling the official narrative, and forcing us to reconsider the fall of Anne Boleyn, not as an act of clear justice, but as a political performance. The tragedy of his life is therefore twofold. He betrayed truth in his silence, yet by living and finally speaking, however faintly, he ensured that truth was not wholly lost. He embodied the contradiction of an age where speech could kill and silence could corrode, where survival demanded compromise and integrity demanded sacrifice. In his last months, he spoke often of Anne's daughter. Elizabeth's reign had stretched into decades, transforming England into a power feared and admired across Europe. The spy, who had once seen Elizabeth as a child, now beheld her as a queen who rivaled her father in authority and outshone him in legacy. To him, Elizabeth was living proof that Anne's bloodline had triumphed over the scaffold. "The mother died," he wrote, "but the daughter reigns. The axe did not sever the root." This recognition gave him a measure of peace, though it could not erase the regret of his silence. He died quietly, without spectacle, sometime in the later years of Elizabeth's reign. No trumpet announced his passing, no monument marked his grave. He slipped into the earth as he had lived, unseen. Yet his words, scattered in the margins of records, whispered to confidants, preserved in fragments, endured. They surfaced in later generations, puzzling chroniclers who sought to reconcile them with official accounts. They added ambiguity where certainty had once reigned, and in that ambiguity lay the power of his legacy. For history is not merely a ledger of deeds. It is a palimpsest of voices, some loud, some silenced, some delayed. The spy's life reminds us that what is unsaid may shape the past as powerfully as what is proclaimed. His 40 years of silence allowed a falsehood to become orthodoxy. His late whisper cracked that orthodoxy, ensuring it would never again stand unchallenged. He was neither hero nor villain, but something more unsettling. A witness whose truth was withheld, then released too late to alter events, but just in time to alter memory. In the centuries that followed, scholars argued over Anne Boleyn's guilt or innocence. Some saw her as a victim of Cromwell's ambition and Henry's lust for a male heir. Others suggested she may have strayed, her quick wit and boldness leading her into perilous intimacies. Yet in all these debates, the spy's testimony hovers like a shadow. He did not proclaim her innocent, but he revealed the machinery of her destruction. He showed that her fall was orchestrated, her trial a performance, her death a necessity for those in power. His words prevent us from ever accepting the official verdict without question. And so, his legacy persists, not in name but in doubt. Doubt is his monument, carved not in stone, but in the minds of those who study the Tudor age. Every time we ask whether Anne was guilty, every time we question Cromwell's motives or Henry's sincerity, we are in conversation with the silence of the spy. His long withholding and his final disclosure created a riddle that history cannot solve. A reminder that the past is never as simple as the records suggest. The story closes then, not with resolution, but with haunting. The spy remains a ghost in the archive, his presence felt in absence, his truth glimpsed through silence. He teaches us that history is fragile, that truth delayed is truth distorted, and that even the most ordinary witness can alter the legacy of queens and kings. His life is a testament to the shadows that move unseen beneath the grand pageants of power, the quiet watchers whose silence shapes empires. And as the last words of his manuscript fade, we are left with the image of an old man at his desk, quill trembling, eyes clouded but mind clear, setting down at last the memory he had carried for 40 years. He writes not for glory, not for absolution, but for release. He knows his name will vanish, but he hopes his memory will not. And so it has not, for we remember him still, not as a man of deeds, but as a man of silence, whose silence speaks across the centuries. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.